So looking a little bit closer at these three terms that we just looked at, politeia, or the city government, the word that gives us politics, we need to understand that because Christians met in homes rather than in public buildings like we do today, that the politeia didn't really directly influence their life because, again, most of these people were people who wouldn't be interesting to the people who managed the city because they were poor people. And so they were largely influenced by the oikonomia and the koinonia around them before and after they became Christians. We need to remember that the Roman Republic was never a democracy. It had been a republic where there were sort of the trappings of democracy that they had inherited from the Greeks to some extent. But then when Caesar Augustus became the emperor in BC 27, everything changed. And it just basically looks a lot like Putin's Russia does today. And then the common people would never have expected the government to have a great deal of influence in them other than to say what they couldn't do. And certainly they wouldn't expect to have any kind of an influence on the government. And then as we look at the oikonomia, which is a hard word for me to pronounce, this extended household was actually the primary unit that was the organizing principle of the Roman Empire. People lived in family groups. As you got into the far-flung regions of the empire, into Londinium, that today we call London, people lived in big houses made out of bark, and 40 or 50 people would live in one household. But the thing that they had going on was that usually there was a strong male leader who had life and death control over the lives of everybody there, whether they're slave or free, or even his children. In ancient Rome, we know that the head of a household could condemn somebody to death, could murder them, and there were no legal consequences. And so all of this control was in this one man. One of the things that we need to understand is that it wasn't all negative. This is what gave society structure. This is what gave people social security, in that I have a job, I have a roof over my head, I know where I'm going to be, I know where I'm going to live, I know where I'm going to die. And we know also in ancient Rome, kind of like China 30, 40 years ago, they valued male children over female children. And so they would, what was called expose. We have writings from ancient history where a soldier wrote to his wife and said, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, expose it. Well, exposing it might mean that you put the child out in the forest and just leave it be as a baby, and the jackals or whatever are going to consume the baby. But quite often people would throw a living child on a city garbage dump, and then often a household or a slave of a household would go and rescue that child from death, but then the child would be raised as a slave in that household. So when you're looking at these early Christians, you got to look at this backdrop and realize that you've got free people, but usually who are very poor, unless they're people of influence. You've got some people of influence, and you got a lot of slaves, and they are clustered together in these households, and in the households are providing a service. One would be in agriculture, a farm. Another is in banking. Another is manufacturing shoes or making shirts or something like that. And so this was the thing that provided life and structure and social structure to the community that these people lived in. And then we have, of course, the koinonia. I talked about this a little bit earlier. The koinonia met deeper emotional needs in the lives of ordinary Romans. And again, pre-church, this would be an unofficial voluntary association. You could think of them as clubs. I can remember in high school, we had social clubs, or, I went to all male high school. We could go to dances with girls' high schools. But I also remember there was a chess club, there was an electronics club, there was a hockey club. There were all these things that gathered people together. And these things exist today around us. And again, I'm just, preaching the same thing over and over and over. We must penetrate these little areas of society or units of society that so often we overlook in the church because we tend to just get into a Christian ghetto. People come to Christ, they come out of these clubs, they come into this world, and then it becomes a little Christian world that they live in, and not much else is going to go on. In the koinonia that existed pre-Christ, there was social strata. In the koinonia that existed post-Christ, after you became a Christian, what you were brought into was egalitarian. The rich people freely associated with the poor people. When I was in Hawaii, one of the struggles that we had, we were adjacent to a military base, and officers weren't allowed to fraternize with enlisted men. But then when they would come to church, they're hanging out together. Or when they would go to what we called mini church at the time, they're hanging out together. It was egalitarian. And so social strata didn't count for much. And this is part of the seeds of what would eventually overthrow the Roman Empire and eventually build the Western world. So as we talk about when oikos met koinonia and politeia, some things kind of there was an interplay and there was some frustration that would have had to have been there. And so the Roman house churches existed kind of on a tension line between oikos and koinonia. They couldn't survive without the social structure and actually the financial well-being, whether even if you're a slave, you got food in your mouth, that is provided by the oikos. And so they had to be a part of that. If the head of the household was a Christian, and we're thinking here Aquila and Priscilla, then there's a church that meets at their house. If the head of the household is not a Christian, he may allow this to happen. If the head of the household is not a Christian, he may frown on it. And so you're going to have to meet down by a riverside or someplace else like this. But you have this interplay, this overlap that goes on. And I think we have it today. You go to work, and in a sense that has become the oikos that you're a part of. You got a boss and everybody's there, but then you got these little lunch hour groups. You got friendships that are born. And today what we know is that separation of church and state in America has turned into something different. It's separation of culture and church. It's just a weird thing. Companies are not allowing people to say the name of God. You're not allowed to share your faith. You can lose your job if you do this. I make it a habit of everywhere I go, I greet everybody on the way out the door. If I'm buying something at McDonald's or at the hardware store or I'm at the bank, wherever I'm at, I end it with, God bless you. And every so often somebody says, well, God bless you. And sometimes people will kind of look around them and they'll go, and you too. And you realize that they've come under this pressure in terms of their oikonomia or their oikos. There are rules that are being put upon them. And if you're going to have people sharing your faith, and this is what we're really talking about here, is how do you and I equip people to share their faith as everyday missionaries in the world that they live in. And sometimes the world that they live in is quite hostile. We got to teach people how to fly under the radar like they had to fly under the radar. Now we're talking pre-persecution Rome here. Paul hadn't lost his head yet. The Christians weren't, coming under fire from Nero at this time, but they still had to, be careful and be gracious. And we're needing to teach people to be careful and to be gracious, but also to prevail, also to come up to a point where we are changing them more than they are changing us. And so you got to look at this thing in this light. I love this. I picked this up from a 2nd century philosopher who didn't like Christians. And here's what he wrote. His name was Celsius, and he was attacking Christianity when he wrote, where other mystery religions invite the pure and righteous, the Christians invite crooks and simpletons, yes, and women and children, the very low of the low. And the very teachers are wool workers and cobblers and laundry workers. I mean, he's slamming the church. I think he's praising the church, that we are egalitarian. We have learned, because of what Jesus told us, not only to love God, but to love our neighbor as ourselves, certainly our neighbor in the household of God, but our neighbor outside the household of God. And we're not holding people, the book of James is all about this. We're not holding one person in higher position in our mind or higher esteem than we are another person. This whole concept of what we've come to appreciate in our society, I think the pillars of Western society are science, education, and democracy. And those are the altars at which people worship. Maybe today it's there's a fourth one, and that's in terms of tolerance. And that's something that we need to recognize and respect and learn how do we work with it. But as we get into this idea of universal democracy, well, it was a commingling of Greek ideas that the Romans had inherited from the Greeks, and certainly the Christians had inherited it because they were part of the Greek-speaking world, and the gospel, what Jesus taught in the gospel. And together, as these things were bonded together through the church, in the church, they gave us what we appreciate in terms of civil liberties and the freedoms that we enjoy today. But again, people paid a price for it. And your people are going to pay a price. They're either going to figure out how to do this really well, or it's going to cost them something, or maybe both. And when I say do it really well, what I'm talking about is you and I equipping people to fly under the radar to get the job done. And we're going to do this by, here's my story. Here's what I shared this week. Here's somebody who got mad at me for sharing this week. I'm sharing these things over the pulpit, right? So that people are going, oh, the pastor's not invulnerable. He's not Superman. If he can do it, I can do it. If he can fail at it, I can fail at it. And then when you got the success stories, you're telling them, or you're telling the stories of the people in the church, or you're scripting people with, here's a couple things that you could use to get into conversations. As this oikos meets koinonia in people's lives, and they function in the day-to-day world, it's our role as equippers of the saints to do the work of the ministry till we come to maturity in Christ. We need to be people who are cognizant of these things. And here's one of the things that I think is really important, is that we've got to be people who kind of get out of our little Christian ghetto and ourselves get into these other oikos. That we, maybe you join a club, maybe, you find some guys to go play golf with, or, one of my friends goes and hangs out in a bar every Sunday night, he and his wife, and they don't even drink, but they've gone to the bar so they can become the pastors of the bar. They sit there every week and make friends with the people who the bar is their club. The bar is their koinonia place. And little by little, they're evangelizing people. A micro church is being born in this place. These are the kind of thoughts that we need to be putting into the minds of our people if we're going to prevail.